Hey everyone, how's it going? So I have another Sunday Miscellany video for you today, and this is a weekly video where I give you a reading update and talk about some of the music that I've listened to and the movies that I've watched during the week. And I always start with the music, and as I've been going on about, I am reading currently The Lives of the Great Composers by Harold Schonberg, and I'm kind of listening along with the composers that he discusses. And the composer whose life I read about this week was Brahms. And so I've been listening to a lot of Brahms this week, and he is a very interesting composer because he was a contemporary of a lot of the great Romantic composers like Wagner and Liszt and Chopin, but he very much rejected that trend. He did not like Wagner or Liszt or a lot of his contemporaneous composers. He worshipped Bach, and a lot of his own music actually sounds sort of like a modernized, updated version of Bach's music, although it's more than that because he has his own musical voice, of course, but I can definitely see the influence of Bach, especially in his German Requiem. His music is lovely. It's always been extremely popular, but yeah, so I have in my playlist for this week, I always leave a playlist of music that I've liked this week or that I think is particularly noteworthy, and in the list is some of Brahms's intermezzi, and these are brief solo piano pieces, and they're all beautiful, but the one that I recommend the most probably is the Intermezzo number 1 in E-flat major, which is a very moving, I think, heartfelt intermezzo. And then I've also included a movement from his third violin sonata, which is very melancholy and solemn, and just really nice. I think it's my favorite thing I've listened to by Brahms so far. And then 2 pieces from his Variations in a Fugue on a Theme by Handel, which is basically a long piano piece, and so I left two little pieces from that. And then a movement from his Symphony Number 4 in E minor, which is like the violin sonata, very sort of solemn and melancholy, but has a grandeur to it that the violin sonata doesn't. That makes it a bit less sad sounding. And then the second big musical endeavor for this week was Zbigniew Preisner, who, if you haven't heard of him, is a living Polish composer who does mostly soundtrack music and had a long-time collaboration with Krzysztof Kieślowski, the great Polish director, who I'm going to be talking about a bit more later. And so Zbigniew Preisner, I think, did the soundtrack for almost all of Kieślowski's films, or at least all the Kieślowski films that I've seen. And one of the films that I watched this week that I'm going to talk about later is The Double Life of Veronique. And that's a 1991 film, and Preisner did the soundtrack, and it's gorgeous, just like his soundtrack for Three Colors Blue. It's just gorgeous. And I have 2 pieces from that, and yeah. And I also just recommend, in general, Zbigniew Preisner. If you aren't familiar with his work, then I recommend it. He's also done some non-soundtrack stuff. His Requiem for My Friend is really good. It's actually a Requiem mass that he wrote when Krzysztof Kieślowski died. But yeah, so I'll leave 2 tracks by Preisner in there, and the link to the Spotify playlist will be below. And then the composers that I'll be working on this week are Hugo Wolf. Actually, I've already read the chapter on Hugo Wolf in here, and he was a big songwriter, a writer of Lieder, and so that should be fun. And then the next chapter is on Strauss and Offenbach, who certainly I will explore some. Johann Strauss, not Richard Strauss. And then after that is Gounod and Saint-Saëns, who are composers I am quite interested in. So anyway, we've got some good stuff coming, so hopefully I'll have a nice playlist for next week. Alright, now we move on to books. And I've already talked about the lives of the great composers. You all have heard enough about that from me. This week, I want the centerpiece of the bookish part to be a review of 2 books that I finished. And so I'm going to review Tracks by Louise Erdrich and Crow Dog by Leonard Crow Dog. So to start with Tracks, it is a novel that takes place in North Dakota on a Chippewa reservation. It is narrated by 2 different people. The first one is Nanapush, who is an old man, a very traditional Chippewa man who practices medicine and traditional religion and so on and so forth, and speaks the language. And he was educated in a Jesuit institution, but very much rejected that education. And his parts are narrated as though they're a sort of letter to his granddaughter, Lulu, who I don't think is actually biologically related to him, but Lulu herself does appear in the story over the course of the story. But anyway, so that's the first narrator. The second narrator is named Pauline, who's a young woman who is sort of the opposite. So she's a young woman, she's a woman, and she very much rejects her sort of Chippewa heritage and wants to go out and make a living in the world outside the reservation, and actually ends up joining a nunnery and becoming like a fanatical Catholic, like really fanatical. She like sews her underwear out of a potato sack to make her uncomfortable. She refuses to clean herself, and all these things to sort of flagellate herself in the same way that Christ suffered at his crucifixion and his passion. And by the way, I didn't mention that this takes place in the early 20th century, roughly around the years of the First World War. And so it has a number of other characters. It has this young woman named Fleur Pillager, who lives sort of in a cabin by herself in the woods. And there's Eli Cashpaw, who starts a relationship with Fleur. There's Eli's mother, Margaret, who disapproves of his relationship with Fleur and tries to stop it, but once she realizes she can't stop it, she sort of accepts it. And Margaret and Nana Push at one point start a relationship, and so there are a lot of characters. There are others that appear that I haven't mentioned, and there are a lot of characters. For such a short novel, it's surprising how many characters there are. And there are a lot of themes that are touched on. So there's the tension between Catholicism and traditional Chippewa faith. There's the encroachment of just white culture more generally onto native culture, and there's the stealing of land. That's sort of a theme, the way that land was stolen from under Native Americans' feet in the 20th century through allotment. That becomes a theme later in the novel. I won't say how because it's sort of a spoiler. There's this medicine that's used throughout the novel, this sort of traditional Chippewa medicine, and medicine as it's used is a bit different from what we think of it. It's sort of like magic. I don't want to say that to be derogatory, but it's like magic that one character will use to sort of manipulate another to do what they want, you know, with sort of charms and a mixture of like herbs and so on. And so that's a big theme as well. So there's all these themes kind of packed in, and I think I think that they're all interesting, but I don't feel like any one of them has really the space to develop very well. You know, this is not only short, it's only just over 200 pages, but it also has like really big margins and everything. And so honestly, this might be more of a novella. The reason that this didn't have that big an impact on me, I think, is because none of the characters really felt like they unfolded very much. You know, they were all good, well-drawn characters, but I felt like they were only the start of characters. You know, they didn't develop, they didn't become more complicated over the course of the story. We just got, you know, the barest inkling of who they are. And that was disappointing and made it hard for me to be all that invested in the story. And I felt like if it had been longer, then I might have become more invested in the characters because I would have gotten to know them more. And yeah, so it was a bit of a disappointment. The writing was gorgeous, I have to say. It really was just a beautifully written novel. I didn't think it might have been better written than Love Medicine, which is saying a lot because I think Love Medicine is a beautiful novel. But yeah, on the whole, a bit of a disappointment, unfortunately. So then I want to review Crow Dog by Leonard Crow Dog. So the subtitle for this is 4 Generations of Sioux Medicine Men, and this was co-written with Richard Erdoes. And Leonard Crow Dog is a Lakota medicine man. He's still alive, and he was the spiritual leader of the American Indian movement, also known as AIM, which was the civil rights movement for Native Americans that was very active from 1960 to 1975. The book itself is a number of different things. So there are sort of miniature biographies of Crow Dog's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. His great-grandfather, Jerome Crow Dog, was actually a contemporary of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and was one of the first practitioners of the ghost dance, which then became outlawed, and which Leonard Crow Dog himself actually revived the ghost dance during one of AIM's what he calls one of AIM's great triumphs at their siege of Wounded Knee. Although it didn't accomplish much, he does see it as sort of a triumph. But so there are these mini biographies of his father and grandfather and great grandfather, and that gives you some insight into how the Lakota lived in the sort of old days. And then there's a big section about religious practices of the Native American Church and the Lakota specifically. So the Native American Church is a religion that has become more popular among Native Americans that kind of is an amalgam of the practices of several different nations. And so he talks a lot about these ceremonies that are important to the Native American Church. And then he also talks about ceremonies that are important particularly to the Lakota. and just describes them in some detail, their importance, what they're used for, you know, the sort of etiquette around them, you know, and just how the logistics of how they're done, you know, who, you know, because there are always several people involved, and different people do different things in these ceremonies. And so he describes those in some depth. And then there's the last part, which is more of a straightforward memoir narrative about AIM, about its activities that he became involved in. And I found the last part to be the most interesting. I'm kind of fascinated by AIM and the civil rights movement of that era, and I think he does a really good job of narrating those events. I think he doesn't go into as much detail as I might like, but it is good, and he's very blunt, you know, he's very doesn't sugarcoat things when he just thinks that the United States government is being corrupt and evil in a way, and I really liked that. So I did enjoy that section, but I'm guessing that there are other more comprehensive histories of AIM that you could go to. I haven't read any, but anyway, yeah, so if any of that sounds of interest to you, then you might like this. I don't think it's exactly the best written book ever. The prose is nothing to write home about, but it is good enough. So anyway, yeah, not like I'm not calling this a must-read, but it would be interesting if the subject interests you. So then other books, just to give you a more broad update on what's going on. So this week I hope to finish both John Brown Abolitionist and the Histories of Herodotus, sorry. I hope to finish both of these big books. I'm almost done with both of them. About 100 pages of each to go. And I'm hoping to do full videos on both of them. So look out for those. I'm really excited for those because they're both fascinating books. But yeah, hopefully I can get the reading done. And then tomorrow I'm actually starting a new buddy read. Bitter Bowler and I are going to buddy read Hunger by Roxane Gay, which is her memoir of when she was raped when she was very young and the effect that had on her. And it's always sounded like a fascinating memoir. I wanted to read it for a long time, so looking forward to that. And yeah, I'll be starting that tomorrow. Another buddy read that I forgot to mention last week, but that is ongoing, is a buddy read with Sean the Bookmaniac of The Lute and the Scars by Danilo Kieś. So this is a short story collection. Danilo Kieś is a Serbian writer of Jewish origin, and he is a fascinating author. He wrote a lot about life under authoritarian regimes, about sort of surveillance and genocide and other things, and he's a fascinating writer. And I've buddy read 2 other books by Danilo Kieś with Sean, and the first story, we've only read the first story, we're reading 1 story a week, and the first story is called The Stateless One, and neither of us really liked it. It read a bit more like an essay that had a sort of fictional element than it did read like an actual short story, because there was no plot or character development or anything like that. It was very well written, some great sentences, some really interesting ideas in it about art and racism and eugenics and other things. But yeah, not a great start, I wouldn't say. But anyway, that's an ongoing buddy read. And then obviously I'm continuing to chip away at the Oxford Anthology of African American Poetry. But again, I don't have much to report on that, so anyway, we'll move on now to films. So I have 3 films to discuss. The first one I want to talk about is the one that I've already mentioned. That's The Double Life of Veronique, which I just finished watching this morning. This is directed by Krzysztof Kieślowski, and was the first film, I believe, that he made outside of Poland. And it has, like a lot of Kieślowski's films, a soundtrack by Zbigniew Preisner, which I have already recommended. And it's a great soundtrack, and what I love about The Double Life of Veronique, as well as Three Colors Blue, another Kieślowski film, is that the soundtracks are like characters on their own. You know, they actually play an integral part of the story. They're not just like background to sort of elevate emotions or anything like that. They really play a part in the story, and that's what I love about the soundtracks of these 2 movies. So I think that was my favorite part of The Double Life of Veronique, even though there's a lot to love about it. It's just gorgeously shot. Has a great lead performance by Irene Jacob, or Irene Jacob, I'm not sure how her name is pronounced, she's French. But yeah, and it has a really weird, kind of enigmatic story. So so it's about a woman named Veronique, who's French, who has this sort of weird psychic connection with this other Polish woman named Veronica. And Veronica is a singer, Veronique is a music teacher, and yeah, they have this weird connection where Veronique early on in the film, Veronica dies, and Veronique suddenly inexplicably feels sad, even though she's never even met Veronica. And so, yeah, it has this sort of weird, enigmatic story, and I felt actually kind of similar after finishing it, as I felt after finishing Mirror, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky for the first time. So, Mirror as well is probably even more enigmatic than The Double Life of Veronique, but, it has a very elliptical, experimental style. It doesn't have, a traditional beginning, middle, and end, and so on and so forth. And so when I watched it the first time, I finished it and I thought, okay, I didn't really understand what happened in that story, but that film was gorgeous, and I felt a similar way with this film, where I don't feel like I understand it, but it was just so gorgeous that I know I will rewatch it. And honestly, I'm considering ordering the Criterion Collection edition of it, because there is a sale ongoing through Barnes & Noble, and so I might be ordering that one to rewatch it. But to move on to another film that I watched was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, directed by Ang Lee. Completely opposite end of the spectrum. But yeah, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is just one of those films where it's become such a meme, It's not one of those films where you feel like you've seen it, even if you haven't seen it, because it's talked about and joked about so much. So I think I've avoided watching it because of that. But then I watched it, and it was just one of those great experiences where you just realize that the hype is all worth it. It totally deserves all the praise it gets. It's such a good movie. I mean, plot, characters, themes, the action sequences. I'm not usually one to swoon over choreography and action sequences. I'm not one of those people who gets enthusiastic about, like, oh, what are the logistics of doing this thing that they did in the movie. I'm not one to really care that much about that. But God, the fight scenes in this movie are like ballet. And yeah, just the character development. It's just one of those films that has the complete package, I think. And I just absolutely loved it. I was blown away. And the scenery, the cinematography, I mean, it's all so good. And that's another one where I thought, right after watching it, I might need to just order a DVD of it, because it's one that I'll definitely want to rewatch. But then the third film that I watched, which ironically, I've been going in reverse order of when I watched them. But the third film that I watched was called Glenn Gould Hereafter, and it's actually a documentary, and it's about Glenn Gould, the great Canadian pianist of the mid-20th century, who specialized in Bach, but also played Beethoven and Hindemith and Schonberg. And it was not a very well-done documentary. It was kind of pretentious, didn't have any kind of narrative arc. There was no sense of a beginning, middle, and end. Interviews and performances were kind of just edited together willy-nilly. It was like the director just kind of threw paint onto canvas and hoped that it landed well. It was just kind of a gracelessly directed film, and it had a lot of these sort of pretentious moments where the camera would be looking out at, like, a forest in autumn from a moving train, while you were listening to Glenn Gould playing something, and the autumn forest had nothing to do with what he was playing, and, it's just like, there's no point to it, it doesn't add anything, there's no point to it. And then there were other things about the documentary that I didn't like there were sort of staged scenes you could see, and whenever there's sort of staged scenes in a documentary, I never like it. There was this one scene where this woman sits down next to a statue of Glenn Gould and, like, talks to it, and there was another scene where they got a crowd of people to pile into a room and listen to Glenn Gould play the Goldberg Variations, a recording of him playing the Goldberg Variations on a radio, and they were all sitting there, like, mesmerized, and the camera would, like, zoom in on their faces. I was like amazed, and I hate that stuff in documentaries. So it's not a great documentary, but Glenn Gould is so fascinating. There were all sorts of interviews with him throughout this, all sorts of footage of him performing and recording and so on, and he himself is so fascinating in his ideas about music and recording and performance and different composers that I was still really interested in the documentary because Glenn Gould is so fascinating. And so, if you're a fan of Glenn Gould, maybe look this one up. You might like it, but it's not a great documentary, but Glenn Gould is so fascinating. I think he's a great pianist. I love his playing. I've listened to some of his recordings. Actually, the Brahms intermezzi that I included in my playlist were performed by Glenn Gould, and I love his recording of the Goldberg variations. I like his renditions of Beethoven. So anyway, I'm a big Glenn Gould fan, and yeah, anyway, he was just a fascinating guy because he rejected performance, he emphasized recording, he rejected a lot of composers that were popular. He, for example, has a hot take at one point in the documentary where he says that Igor Stravinsky is the most overrated composer of the 20th century. Don't know if I agree, but I just was amused by that. He never played Franz Liszt or Chopin. Well, he did play some Chopin, but he didn't like Chopin that much. So he rejected a lot of the composers that we think of as, integral to the piano repertoire. And yeah, so he was just a fascinating guy, and so it was an interesting documentary, but not a great documentary. So anyway, that's all. I hope you all enjoyed. If you've read any of the books or listened to any of the music or watched any of the movies, let me know your thoughts, and I'll let you all go, and I'll hope you have a nice week.